And now we're going over to Sarah Lurcock, who is the Director of South Georgia Museum.
Thank you, Alison. Can you just confirm for me you can see that screen, please? Thank you very much. I was listening to Sophie talking, and I just was so taken by how many echoes there are between the two worlds that we're representing that are actually really very different worlds. And I picked up on so many little cues there about people trying to grow things, about James Marr, who's one of my great heroes from South Georgia, about the importance of food, so many things. And I also just love that final comment really there about trying to bring things to life. And that's very much a theme, I think, through what I wanted to share with you tonight. Now, not all of you here will know where South Georgia is. So many more of you might have rather bypassed us and headed straight on down to the Antarctic Peninsula, but we are close by. So just having a little look here, thanks to Google Earth, we're in that Scotia arc there. There's the island of South Georgia, and it is around 100 miles long. And on that northern coast there is where the only centre of population is. And that's here at King Edward Point. It's right in the centre of the island on the northwest coast. It's the home for, in the foreground here, King Edward Point. This is where the government and science personnel currently live. And then you see in the distance around the other side of the cove with the only bit of track on the whole island, pretty much a 1 kilometre rough old track leading round to the old whaling station there at Grytviken. And to the right, you might just see there the red roof of the museum, which is housed in the old whaling manager's villa. Everyone arriving at South Georgia has had to come by sea. So if you're lucky with the weather, you might have enjoyed fantastic views as you come down. This is really quite the most extraordinary island. It's been described as mountains rising straight out of the sea. So they may even have visited some of our major wildlife sites on the island, here, for instance, at St Andrews, before they then pull in, and all the ships do come in eventually to Grytviken. I've done this journey some 20 or more times, and I am struck every single time how you're seeing yourself coming down on the chart on the ship's bridge, and you realize that Grytviken is a pinprick on the island. And yet I am so aware now, having done this a few times, how quickly that little pinprick just becomes your world, because we're there for 6 months at a time. Now, if you are coming to Grytviken, for many people, the highlight, the draw, is going to be the grave of Sir Ernest Shackleton, the great explorer, which is in Grytviken Cemetery. And as for that whaling station, well, I think people come, they know it is a whaling station because they've been told about it by the staff on the cruise ships before they get there. But I do think, you know, without knowing more about it, it is probably just a bit of a junkyard that they're walking through on their way to reach the museum and the post office. So I think sometimes the more imaginative amongst them might somehow sense some ghosts of the past, but I don't think it's easy for them perhaps to really understand what the site's all about. The museum itself, it actually belongs to the government of South Georgia and the collection too, and it's run for them by the South Georgia Heritage Trust. And its first inception came about because Nigel Bonner, he was an ex-sealing inspector from the island, and he realized that, you know, there was a lot of whaling ephemera in the whaling stations on the island, but it was disappearing. People were souveniring and they were taking the precious metals for their metal value. And so if nothing was done, this heritage and the evidence of this huge industry was just disappearing. And so he helped with others to start the museum. And it's that first iteration of the museum, it was all about whaling. Now, I wanted to share with you too this little quote I've got up at the top here, because Nigel noticed even in those first seasons where really they had very few visitors, that actually those visitors to the museum had very little time. Grytviken's a big site, and there's quite a lot to see with the church and the cemetery and the station and the museum. And so he realized that the displays within the museum needed to be clear, easily explained, and you should be able to absorb them really quite quickly. And that's still very much the case today. So the museum opened in 1992, but it's developed a good deal from those days, with a succession of different people running the museum. It's been slowly changed into a museum representing all things about South Georgia and to some extent the South Sandwich Islands, which is part of the same territory. So now you'll see the natural history, you'll see about the discovery of the island and early exploration and mapping, about the current science, the natural history, and of course, we also tell the story of Shackleton, and of course his story is very, very attached to the island through both the Endurance expedition and the last one, the Quest expedition. But just as the museum grew and was representing more, the whaling station itself was being diminished. These old stations were full of pollutants, and so it was decided that a major cleanup was needed, and this was undertaken in 2003-04. And you might be able to see here how actually what was left really was nothing much like the town that it had looked before. The chimneys went, a lot of the buildings went, just leaving foundations, and what was left was the machinery inside those buildings. So really even more difficult for our visitors to understand. So we began to wonder how we could make it more accessible to the people coming. One of the early iterations of that was to have these super signs. There's a whole trail of them through the whaling station, showing people what they're looking at, what it used to do, and it'll lead you through the story of the station. I do see people interacting with those and learning from them. They like to take their own time to do that. But a lot of people pass those by too. So for me, it seemed really obvious that we needed to add a little drama. And the way to do that, of course, is through guided tours. It is, in my view, it's a performance when you do these tours. Here you see Lorna stood in the foundations of what used to be the main kitchen at Grytviken, and she is telling these people how many men lived in the building behind her. You know, there was 150 men living in there, and about, you know, what it was like with the cooking and how important the food was to the whalers. Through these tours then, we really want to tell the story of the 400 men that would have been working, and we want to try to evoke some of the sense of what the whaling station might have been like. We want, by talking to them about it, for them to get a sense of the terrible smell of the place, the noise, the steam, the stench, the rot and detritus throughout the area. And of course, we also want them to understand that, you know, with such an enormous industry and many stations around the island, what the effect of this was on the environment. And so we do also talk about the devastation of the whale stocks in the seas, and how eventually, of course, that led to the station's closing in the mid-1960s. Well, we are on a sub-Antarctic island, and so when we're doing those tours, we're often challenged by the weather. We're trying to sneak our groups of people into areas where they might get a little bit of lee from one of the structures in the station. We are famed for what are called the willy wars. In the top right-hand side there, you see one of these little screaming winds piling into King Edward Cove, and when they hit, you know about it. And of course, sometimes the weather is severe enough that some of our visitors never reach us. They simply, it isn't safe for them to land. If they've got time, they might manage again the next day, but sometimes it just can't happen. And of course, you know, as we arrive back to the island, normally would be getting there about this time of year, a little bit later, and in a big snow winter, then there's still plenty of snow around well into summer. In fact, I do remember a time when we skied to the church on Christmas Day. That's right in the middle of summertime after a big snow year. And that can be quite challenging logistically, because at the beginning of the season, you're trying to get everything that you need over into that museum. And the logistics and the challenges of running a place at the end of the supply chain that can only be reached by sea, most of our stuff coming from the UK, it's very similar to what the whalers themselves had to deal with. And of course, you need to order everything in very good time. We're ordering months in advance. If it's not there for the start of the season, you might have a chance to reorder something. You can't nip round the corner there to the DIY shop. But the chances are, even if you order it just as you arrive, it won't arrive on the island until you have actually reached the end of the season. Now, with that museum being inside the heritage building, it is actually unheated. We're often working in the museum in padded overalls. It's really cold, so we all have thermals. And of course, that means for the artifacts that are stored within the museum, there are additional challenges with an environment that changes just as quickly as the outside environment changes. So we want to keep the artifacts safe, and that's a large part of what our curator is doing, assessing the condition of our collection and making sure it's in the best conditions that we can provide. And I've just added this little graph here. We have these little tags that measure temperature and humidity, and this is a comparison trial between two different types of cases. The lower two lines, the blue and the black lines there, are measuring the temperature within a sealed case and a case that has just been built into the museum. And so our most precious artifacts need to be in these environmentally controlled sealed cases. And if you look at the red line right at the top, that is the same line over time inside that sealed case. It's really very good. It shows very little change in relative humidity, whereas the green line beneath it is what's happening inside the unsealed case. So this is the sort of way that we can help to preserve what the things within the museum and try to keep them at their very best. So in the years since the museum started, the tourism industry has really built. And we used to have mostly an English-speaking audience. The very first tourists were mainly the Americans. But boy, that has really changed, especially in recent years. We now have operators. You see this ship here. This is one of the Ponant vessels. They're French. So we get more French visitors. We have another company visit regularly called Hapag-Lloyd, and they're German. And you can see possibly from this pie chart borrowed from one of the government reports that now I would say almost 50% of our visitors are no longer English speaking as a first language. So how do we reach them? Well, we have various methods of doing this, and we're really, really grateful to work with the translators on board these vessels. They're often multi-languages on board the vessels themselves, and so they have excellent translators working with them. So going out on those tours at times, we might be being translated into 3 different languages while we're doing a guided tour. Sometimes that's with the help of more technical stuff. So they have things like the whisper system, headphones, so that people can be translating at the same time as we're speaking. but often it's actually just people in little gathered groups around us, all having translations into different languages. And then once they're within the museum, we've tried to make the museum objects, the highlights of the museum, more available by having the highlights translated into a number of different languages as well. But we are aware that most people won't ever visit South Georgia. So how to make the museum available to all those people? This is a long-held plan, and actually the current situation we find ourselves in, being unable to return to the island, has really helped with this, because we've had a little more time and we've been able to make real progress towards our new South Georgia Museum website. And tonight is actually the first official announcement of this website, and we're still working on it, but we're quite pleased with the result, and we really hope it's going to help people to access the museum and its collection. So we're going to have various features on the website that are going to bring it back to people's attention quite regularly by, for instance, having an object of the month, and we'll put that out on our Facebook and so on. We've also got an Insta account, so people can access us that way. We have a collection of highlights. It's very easy for people just to have a very quick look at the website and see the very best things, or it's also easy to go in there and search deeper in the collection. This website's going to develop. It's got a few fun features as well, and we've got plans to do more there. So when you have an extra hour in the next few days, do come across to the museum website, and hopefully you'll find out a lot more about our museum. So to get back to the title of the talk tonight, you know, why do we tell the whaler's tale? For me, it's always been about trying to put the men back into the station. I always say that. I want to try to evoke the lives of the thousands of different men, and it was a very masculine world. They spent months, some of them spent years at the other end of the world from where they normally lived. And of course, you know, it was a bloody but lucrative trade. But there's more to it than that, telling this story. And I'm going to take you to a conversation that we had. We were stood on the front steps of the museum one day, and a lady came up the stairs and sort of asked us quite angrily, you know, why all this industrial rubbish just allowed to remain on this fantastic island, and why wasn't it all being cleared away? You know, this was awful. So I spent a little while talking to her, and I mentioned about how, you know, actually when you look on a map, the whaling stations are just a pinprick. They are a tiny amount of space taken up on a large island. And when you get into those stations and you see the sheer extent of them, it helps our visitors and the wider world, I hope, to understand the sheer scale of what happened there. You know, the persistence of this hunt that went on for 60 years on the island, and the upshot of that, which was the near extinction of some of these whale species in our waters. And if you don't have any evidence of that left, is it all too easy just to brush that story under the carpet and almost pretend it never happened? And I'd like to think that after we'd spoken for a while, that she conceded the point. Now, what I didn't do was go on and tell her, because I don't think I'd have won this one, that for me, I actually see real beauty in these heritage sites. It's always excited me. I think it's because I was brought up in the shadow of Didcot power stations with those fantastic cooling towers. And so I have always loved this rusting, red, stunning environment. I also love to walk away from it and disappear up into the mountains and the hills. But I don't know, you know, I'm pretty sure now that I'm not the only one that sees the world this way, because I think if there weren't others who felt the same, then we wouldn't have, for instance, here in the UK, the UNESCO sites in Cornwall and West Devon mining landscapes, also the Derwent Valley Mills in Derbyshire, the Big Pit Museum in Wales. There is beauty and there's lessons to be learned from these sites. So the whaling station at Grytviken, the other whaling stations, and of course the museum there at Grytviken, we're there to inform people. We're helping to acknowledge a controversial history of the island. And we hope that when our visitors leave this site, they not only understand that story better, but perhaps also they contrast that with the more positive changes that they may have heard about and seen on the island. Now, there's another whole story here. It'll have to go for another night, but the habitat restoration projects that have been going on this island have made real differences, and the government's good management of the modern day fisheries and the tourism. This is a really positive message, and the benefits of getting this right are underlined, I think, by the evidence of seeing what happens when you get it wrong. Now, as Sophie was saying, we should really be packing right now and heading south once more to open the museum, but that's just can't happen this year. But I'm glad to say that through the portal of the new museum website, whilst the museum doors are not currently open, the museum still very much is. So do come and visit us soon. You see the website details there. And thank you very much for having me talk tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Sarah.